Welcome to the place where you'll hear from HR leaders, people experts, and wellbeing professionals. You'll learn about their personal and professional journeys, hear about the future of HR and wellbeing, and take away actionable insights and tips. This is the HR and Wellbeing Insider podcast. Welcome to this episode of the HR and Wellbeing Insider. Today, I'm talking to Alistair Fraser, founder of Justly, the compensation and reward consultancy. Alistair's going to talk about pay transparency, compensation and total reward, and also talk about why creating a total reward strategy really isn't that difficult. I hope you enjoy the episode. I will link Alistair's company Justly in the show notes below, and don't forget to sign up to our newsletter to hear more from us. See you in the episode. Alistair, thanks for joining today. Really good to have you here.
Hey, Paul. Yeah, good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Really keen to find out about all your expertise and value today. To start off with, it'd be great to understand what first drew you into HR, reward and compensation, and how did that spark the career that you've had to date?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I'll go right back to the beginning. I fell into accidentally when I joined my first startup. I was actually part of growing a client team. And that ended up being the largest department within that organization. It was me, 4 founders, and that was it. And we grew up to about sort of 70, 80 people. And we hit this sort of inflection point where we didn't have HR. It was an office manager doing a little bit. I was doing a lot of HR as part of my role in growing the client team. And we needed to mature as an organization. We needed to make sure we had a consistent approach to HR and people operations across the organization, because we were going to scale from those 70, 80 people and double, if not triple in size over the next sort of 2 years. We went out to market. We looked for someone to bring in house with that capability, and conversation kept on coming back to me. Like, Al, you're doing all these things. Why don't you take on the role? So I took on the role. I sort of officially became head of people in the organization and used my knowledge of learning on the job. I'd not done HR before. I was a landscape gardener before that.
Wow.
That's another story. And
Wow. Okay.
essentially learn on the job, improve the processes across the organization, because everyone was working in silos in terms of how they were recruiting, how they were onboarding, how they were paying people, which we're going to obviously discuss a lot today.
Yeah.
So that's how I fell into it. And I just loved working with people. I love process. I like operations. So it was a really good match for me. And essentially, yeah, took that knowledge on to work in another startup. I love the early stage of companies where it's quite, rough and ready. And I worked in another startup, again, taking the same principles, simplicity, not overcomplicating things, essentially, when, not putting in bureaucratic processes. It's everyone's just needing to get stuff done in order to keep the lights on in these early stage, startups. And then fell into consultancy work around 2017.
Nice. And in terms of like that rough and ready, startup vibe, what's your favorite thing about working in startups? Because it really is rough and ready.
Yeah, it is. I think it's now work as a consultant helping these startups, and I'm able to still sort of hang on the coattails of their work. As it reminds me of the early days when I was in those previous companies I mentioned, when I was in-house. And I think there's just this element of excitement and togetherness about what they're creating. Is it going to, change the world or not? Like there's this element of, excitement that it still gives me a buzz, but I'm not actually day in, day out in it, but I can dip in and out of different companies. So I will be working with maybe anywhere between 5 to 8 different early stage companies at a given time, and super exciting. They're usually working on obviously something that perhaps is quite groundbreaking. So I find that really interesting as well, learning about the businesses. So I get that hit, but with multiple companies, but I'm also not fully in-house with just one company at any given time.
Cool. You've got your own solo consultancy now, Justly. You're a compensation and reward expert.
Yeah.
What was the moment within that career, across those startup experiences that you had? What was the moment that actually got you to the point of saying, or coming to the point of compensation, reward, pay, transparency? That's my lane. Like that was for me. How did you to get where you are now?
You know what? That started right at the beginning. We were hiring people. And if I sort of think about even before I moved into HR and I was a part of the client team, we were hiring people as part of that process. And, I was running that process with the COO. and we were bringing in people with the same job title. Let's call it, I don't know, customer success manager. But Ted was on 50K, and then, I don't know, Sarah was on 35, and Zishan was on 45. And there was this like, well, why are they all on different rates? They've got the same job title, they're doing the same thing. And it came down to essentially negotiation. And it really sort of struck me. I was like, this doesn't feel right. So one of my tasks there that I took upon myself was to start trying to develop essentially a reward strategy for the client team. And we then rolled that out across the whole company. But it really struck a chord with me, like, fairness, trust is like a really important value to me, hence the company name, Trust Justly, and what's morally right and fair. And you know what, if you can get reward right from an early stage, it takes a lot of the headaches, a lot of the time and thinking away from employees about, am I being paid fairly? It gives leaders in the business time back, so they're not thinking about or getting asked about comp all the time, because if people are asking about compensation all the time, you're not probably getting it right and you're not being transparent enough. If you get it right and transparent, you can take maybe 90% of those questions. You're always going to have a few questions around comp, but you can take all those questions away, and then people can concentrate on what they're supposed to be doing, which is obviously their job. Yeah. So reward was always a common theme that came up in employment surveys, both when I was in-house, even with certain things that we put in place. I was then, as I say, in the second startup I was in, we got reward nailed down really well, in my opinion. The CEO, bonded on that pretty much from my interview. He saw the value in getting it right as well, having been a second time founder and, knowing the things that he knew second time round. And reward and getting it right from day one was one of them. So he actually got me into consulting. I was sort of moonlighting when I was in-house. I was working as an employee, as head of people at Nested. But I was then asked to go out and help certain founders. Hey, Al, would you just mind going and spending a couple of hours with Jacob or Sarah or whoever it be? And they're starting a startup. They're about 10 or 15 people. And can you just take what we did with reward and just give them some lightweight, ideas on how to do it? And I was like, while I was being paid essentially for this, I was sort of, paid the salary, right? And I was in-house. I was like moonlighting as a consultant. So I saw an opportunity. And then, as I say, moved, that was sort of just a natural. I liked consulting. I liked helping as many people as possible. I saw the value that I was driving, pretty much immediately, with some very basic principles around reward. So yeah, reward was something that's I'm very passionate about, as I say, from the beginning, around trust, fairness. It's something that everyone needs. And it was something, as I say, in terms of consultancy, I saw a gap in the market.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I've been there before with roles. And actually, you talked about it did come down to negotiation and people sort of negotiating salaries.
Yeah.
Through my experience of going for different roles and jobs, sometimes I've had that sort of awkward conversation with recruiters or founders around, well, what did you earn in your last role and what would you like to earn here? And actually, it's always felt like in those conversations, it wasn't very transparent. Do you think companies should be, when they are recruiting, saying this is the salary for this role and this is why the salary is where it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's the premise of ultimately getting salary bands on job adverts, making a statement of this is the rate that we'll pay. If you want to even go double click and go deeper on that, like how you've arrived on the numbers, that's your compensation, essentially, philosophy and strategy. And some companies are very open about that. And that, I think, as part of that recruitment process, just speeds up everything for everyone. Everyone's on the same page in terms of, I am going to apply for this role. Those numbers sit within the range that I would like to be in. Others that see it as too low will filter themselves out. And I know some businesses then get nervous about that. Like, are we missing out on great talent? Well, if you are thinking you are, then you need to obviously up your market rate.
Yeah. And we see that, don't we? So in the market, I see, and I think a lot of us see competitive salary. Why don't all companies be transparent with their salary brackets? Because we see a lot of the competitive salary on job adverts.
Yeah.
In your opinion, why do companies get nervous about sharing that detail?
There's a few reasons. One, which I just mentioned, like possibly putting that rate on there, which is the rate that they can afford and they're going to pay, and missing out on candidates who just, filter themselves out, self-select, like that rate's too low. So putting something on competitive is extremely subjective, but it will still widen your net, both good and bad, that you'll get those people who want the higher salary apply. But then you'll just go through that cat and mouse game of, well, they wanted 100, but actually our budget was like up to 70. And then it just comes, cat and mouse and negotiation. And maybe you do go up to 100, but then what issues does that cause internally? So one of them is worried about, essentially the people self-selecting themselves out. The other is giving up their competitive numbers and position to their competitors. So we don't want to show other people what we're paying, because then they can up their rates, outdo us, So there's nervousness around that. And then finally, I think, and the big one really is, if we put that salary band on a job role and there's a job title such as, I don't know, senior sales account executive, we don't pay our senior sales account executives that number right now. We've got some of them on 15, 20, 30% less than that. So if we show that and our internal team see that, that's going to cause an enormous amount of upset and challenges that they just quite frankly don't want to face. But certainly in Europe and certain states in the US, salary bands are going to be, or in the US already, salary bands on job adverts are mandatory. And in Europe, that's very fast becoming the case with the incoming EU pay transparency laws. So they need to get their house in order. And if they don't get their internal house in order, then they'll hit exactly that last point I mentioned there. They'll be putting adverts out there with bands on that people say and point at that, well, that's not what you're paying me. Now, if you're paying someone within a range, there's that's a tolerance, and you can then have a conversation on why someone's at the bottom or the top. But if they're not even in that range, that's a whole nother challenge.
Yeah, I was going to say that's going to open up some challenges or a can of worms. And in terms of like the market now and businesses, we talk a lot about engagement and retention of good quality people, and also attracting the right people to the role. Compensation's a big part of that. How, sort of, for people on the front line that might not be, a HR expert, what experiences have you had or seen or implemented where having a compensation and pay transparency strategy really linked to, boosted employee engagement, better morale, increased retention of key talent?
So, I mean, the transparency around pay, as I say, that just builds trust that you're paying someone within, certain parameters. They understand those parameters and how they can move through that salary band. And essentially, as I say, I keep coming back to, that builds trust and an engaged and loyal workforce. And there's lots of studies out there with certain figures I'm sure we can reference. None spring to mind. But I always talk about that trust is the glue of life. And if you can build that trust around pay, which is incredibly important to people, then we'll have it will diffuse through the organization around other things, such as other people processes, and build trust generally as an organization that they know that I'm being paid fairly, being assessed for my performance and progression fairly. Again, that all forms into your compensation philosophy and pay principles. And it comes back to just people being able to sleep at night and not worry about pay and get on with their job, what you hired them to do, and not be thinking and looking over their shoulder as to why someone else is being paid more or less, probably more than them. The thing to note there is pay is just one part of that whole compensation piece, right? There's benefits to think about. There's, possibly equity and share option schemes to think about. There's LTIPs and long-term incentive programs. There's all these other elements that go into that base pay. Well, not base pay, but that reward strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we touch on the wider compensation benefits reward piece, for HR leaders, HR managers, people leaders that haven't really sort of thought about pay transparency, what do you think the common misunderstandings are for HR leaders still when it comes to pay transparency and salary bands?
I think the first one, everyone always goes nuclear and thinks salary bands on job adverts, or even going a step further than that. Maybe this is the nuclear option, which is everyone knowing everyone's salary. So I know what you're earning, Paul, and you know what I'm earning. But that's not pay transparency. And Pay transparency is giving the employees an understanding of how and why they're paid, what they're paid, where the numbers have come from, how you decided on the numbers, the salary band, the range, how you then, if you want to again double click into that, how you decided whether Paul, you sit at the bottom of the band, Alistair, I sit at the top. Like, that is transparency, not showing everyone's salary. Showing me the range for my current level and role is really, really useful and transparent, and perhaps the earning potential for the level above. I'm a people ops person. I don't need perhaps in a company to know what the sales team are on or software engineers are on, because again, that can upset people. And again, it's about, transparency is a spectrum and it's a journey. So start with just the individual, giving them clarity on their pay, how it was determined, what their range is and earning potential for the next, level. Then think about, okay, well, do you want to start slowly opening up more about pay transparency, showing the software engineers what the sales team earn and vice versa? Ultimately, people talk about pay. So if you can control that narrative, that's great. Otherwise, people will reach their own conclusions. But there is a degree of, in a lot of companies I work in, Paul, like people go, well, we don't want the customer team to know how much the software engineers are on, because they're on, like, some of them, from a seniority point of view, they're both a level 3 within their distinctive disciplines. But we're paying software engineers twice as much as a customer service manager, right? They're both managing people, but their disciplines are very different. And people still get nervous about that. So how to be transparent and show the salaries across different, departments. That's a bigger topic, and usually one that is not a problem, but companies will kick down the road, but you can't kick it too far.
Yeah. Interesting. And I suppose linking compensation, reward, benefits, perks, the whole market at the moment, when we think about employee benefits, well-being, total reward, I mean, there's lots going on. Businesses are under pressure to keep their staff, to attract new staff. We've had it in the UK, the recent national insurance changes. In your opinion, in your view, how does, sort of compensation, benefits, perks, well-being, how are they all linked from a business perspective?
So, yeah, I step back. How I link them, I talk about that being what you just described there as a total reward strategy. And your strategy, if you break it into two areas, you've got your extrinsic motivators, your sort of cash elements of the base salary, perhaps bonuses, maybe stock options, pensions, benefits, things that are kind of really quite tangible and actually turn the dial on someone's essentially cash outgoings in their life, right? Then you'll have the intrinsic motivators, the mission statement of the company, the purpose, why people join your company, the professional development that's available. That starts to sometimes perhaps blur into the extrinsic because it's an L&D, like how much the L&D budget is. But the team that they're working with, because these things get people through the door and obviously do keep them engaged, but ultimately it's the intrinsic motivators, the purpose that really drives why people turn up every day and work as hard as they do. But these two things are working in tandem to create your total reward strategy. So it's a balancing act, because some companies might be cash poor. They might not have big budgets to pay big salaries. They might not be able to have the best benefits package. So these things might not be market leading, but they make up, right, for those perhaps deficits there in other ways. Perhaps they have the best, intrinsic motivators. Joining a company that has a strong social purpose, giving back to the wider community, helping with certain environmental or societal challenges. People will say, I'll take half the amount of pay because I know I'm having a positive impact on society. So it's a balancing act. Some companies will not have an employee option scheme. Some companies will have, a best in class pension scheme. Others won't, because they'll say, we'll give you the basic pension, but look at all these other things we do. So sitting down and just listing all these things and deciding as a company, like, where you want to sit and what feels right for you. It needs to be financially, obviously, viable as well, but also something that aligns with your company's mission, values, which are ultimately, led by all the time, led by the founders and what kind of company that they want to create. So what I just described there is the compensation philosophy and strategy.
And for a startup that is focused on growth, focused on sales, marketing, how hard is it for a startup to implement? a total reward strategy?
It's not difficult, and I'm going to say that because that's what I help people with day in, day out. But it really isn't difficult. You shouldn't be worried. You do not have to start out with some incredibly, complex document. Just getting the basic fundamentals, like what are your principles around, what do you believe is fair pay? Why you pay? Perhaps, I don't know, if what your location-based pay philosophy is. So just listing down all of the elements that go into base pay. Thinking about, as I say, what you want to be known as an employer in terms of your benefits, your pensions, we're not going to do bonuses right now. They're too complex. We've got too many moving parts. So, OKRs or goals or KPIs, they're changing all the time. So we're just not going to do bonuses. It's just too complex. It's going to slow us down. So thinking about these things right now, documenting them, literally can be a single page. And just that page will give people clarity, as I say, around how and why they're being remunerated in the way that they are. Why are you paying me 30 to 50 when I'm seeing job adverts out there for the same role as 50 to 70? Well, first of all, we do all these other things. Does that company? Right. Secondly, we don't have an endless supply of money. We're in a particular stage of growth and we have a certain runway and we need to be financially responsible. We could hire on those salaries, but we'd have less people doing more work and being more stressed, which isn't a particularly good equation. So we find, a sweet spot. So just documenting all of that, it really isn't difficult. Then you can start developing that strategy and iterating on over time. But it's not difficult to do. It really is.
Yeah. And do you think this is about communication as well? Because doing these things, like you said, is not that difficult, but communication and explaining and having conversations with people from a HR, reward perspective, is that a really big part of this?
So that document I talked about, let's call it a compensation philosophy. It's one page. You obviously need to not just stick it on a wiki or an internal intranet and just sort of go there one and done. Like, it needs to be communicated. There's two things that need to happen. You need to train your managers on it, right? Explain to them how and why you reached these conclusions. So when I say we, I'm talking about perhaps, the HR/people team and certain senior stakeholders within the business, a founder, a CFO, etc. Why you reach these conclusions, these principles, the way in which you're, designing your pay. Train managers, because ultimately they're going to be the interface, the ones having these conversations with the employees. And what you don't want to happen is an employee does read the document, asks their manager, and manager just turns around and goes, I'm not too sure, go and speak to them because they did it. So they need to be behind it, right? When you do build it, you need to build it with a really good cross-section of individuals in the organization. So you get a good diverse perspective. So it's not a people team or an HR team, it's a business. I always say this document, right, is a business tool, not an HR tool. So everyone in the business should be part of building it. How wide you make that sort of comp committee and design of the, wouldn't recommend any more than sort of maybe 7 or 8 people max.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take long. Then, as I say, you want to train managers on how you reach this. Train managers on any perhaps tricky conversations that people will have around pay, and equip them with the right tools. So that's the comms piece. I think step back, before you launch it or during the launch. Again, I always stipulate with the clients I work with, this shouldn't be the head of people standing in front of the business and say, hey, here's our compensation philosophy. We've been working on this. You said we needed it. We've built it. That needs to come from the CEO, like 100%.
Yeah.
It's that important.
Yeah, really key.
New onboarding program, or perhaps a new performance management tool, or I don't know, another people process, possibly. But pay is so important. It needs to be a founder-led launch and initiative, in my opinion.
Yeah. You just said there pay is really important, and we've talked about pay transparency, salary, financial well-being in effect. In the UK and globally, lots of talk around the cost of living and the increases to live and all of this sort of financial well-being pressure that we're all experiencing as people and as businesses. I'm seeing in the market, when it comes to financial well-being, quite a bit of traction in sort of well-being allowances and money to spend on benefits and things like that. From a financial well-being perspective, what are the benefits and initiatives that you've seen recently working really well?
I mean, a lot of my work is, as I say, focused primarily on helping companies build structure around base salary. Inevitably, when we're doing that, it then bleeds into like, what are the other levers that we can pull from a cash perspective? So I guess that's the question you're asking there. I think I'm actually seeing companies cutting back on benefits as opposed to doubling down on them. I'm seeing companies actually starting to really challenge their current benefits. Are they being utilized? You know, we talked a little bit about like, what's the ROI of having private health cover? What's the ROI of having, you know, this other app that's going to help people with, you know, mental health well-being? Now, I'm not downplaying those. They're incredibly important, but companies are the ones that I think are get the right strategy in place are the ones that listen to their team. So they will send out a survey. They want to really understand, you know, are these other ways in which we're all currently rewarding you that actually attractive? Are they useful? Because ultimately what I'm hearing, I don't send these surveys out, but what people are telling me is that people would just prefer to have cold hard cash in their pocket to address these sort of cost of living challenges. There are ways you can do that. Yes, you can change your market rates. I think one-off bonuses, I know some people, there was a sort of about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, people were doing sort of cost of living crisis one-off bonuses and sort of saying, look, we're just going to give you a certain amount now rather than moving all of our rates up, because that will then shift everything up and it's going to make us, you know, far more, you know, it's going to affect our budgets over a much longer period. So people were doing these sort of one-off cost of living bonuses. I haven't heard of anyone do those in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, but there was a kind of quite a fashion for doing those a while back. So, you know what? It really varies from company to company, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really, I think the ones that get it right are the ones that just ask their employees and don't guess.
Yeah. It's conversation again, isn't it? It's asking people, it's having a conversation internally, and it's understanding your team and your business.
Yeah.
And you've just brought back a memory there. Cost of living bonuses. Yeah. I've not actually heard of any of those recently either. Yeah. That's another thing to think about, how these things come and go. And actually, I mean, that brings me sort of to a question of, you know, in the boardroom, founders, CEOs, leadership teams, how has the conversation around total reward changed in the last sort of 5 years?
Gosh, in the last 5 years, I think it's becoming more of a conversation. Like, you go back 5 years, it was just a budget item, you know, like total reward would have just been something that was discussed typically. I'm thinking, you know, out loud here, maybe at the end of the year budgeting, like what do we need in terms of cash, right, element to sustain our current team and their salaries, and what's the hiring plan look like, and how are we budgeting for that future hiring plan? And that was pretty much it. I think there would have been small line items, you know, in that budget that sort of talked about, well, we're budgeting this amount for pensions, obviously, and contributions, and we're going to keep them at the minimum, and we're going to budget this amount for certain benefits, private health cover, life insurance, etc. I think what we've seen over the last 5 years is a lot more positive, but like a lot more noise around I guess there's more in terms of benefits. They're becoming a lot more, rather than it just used to be private health cover, there's a lot more benefits that are coming out. So there are a lot more challenges around, because the spending's going up, and those people sitting around the table are wanting to know why the spending's going up and what's it's going on. There's also then going to be more noise around, as I say, structured pay and introducing salary bands and pay transparency. So all of these are being driven by, you know, the market, by the employees, by the progressive people teams, and they're wanting a voice at that table. It used to be just typically a budgeting conversation, and it was quite straightforward. Now it's like a lot more structured around, like, what's the philosophy we're going to build? How are we going to, how's that philosophy going to actually change over time as well? You know, we used to pay in this way. We used to give just these standard benefits. Now you're telling us we need a much wider portion of benefits. Why? So there's a lot more of a conversation going on there.
Yeah, definitely. And it's certainly what I'm seeing it, you know, and I see it from people like you. I see it on LinkedIn, people talking about transparency, compensation, reward, benefits, which leads me nicely into Justly, you know, your organization, you help start up small businesses. Where do they go for this information when it comes to sort of, you know, salary banding data, and how do you help, or how can you help, you know, startups and small businesses?
Sure. So I help a lot of companies that have got a blank canvas. They've done nothing. Obviously, they're paying people, but perhaps it's been in a very unstructured way, just essentially paying what people ask for. And obviously, we know that then can lead to some quite significant challenges. 5, 6 people doing all the same role on varying salaries. So how I help is I essentially help organizations create a formulaic approach to pay. So introducing the job architecture, which again might have grown organically and they've thought about and thought they had in place, a junior, mid, senior, some exec levels or managerial levels. They've got loosely perhaps created, they have teams, they're paying, they haven't sort of grouped similar roles into similar, what they call job families. So I guess what I'm getting at there is help introduce job architecture, which is the sort of backbone. You need levels and you need job families. And that will then give you an understanding of how you're currently paying in your organization. But then more importantly, that's like your passport to then go out and map to the market and say, right, if we have a level 2 marketing manager, which we've, now classified, what's the market rate for that? And then that's where you can go off and use, different sources. I guess where I help organizations is understand what market data sources to use, because there's a lot out there. And simply matching on job title isn't the most, should we say, robust way of doing salary benchmarking. So helping organizations get that job architecture, that sort of passport, if you like, to map to the market, helping them understand what market data sources they should be using, because there are good ones and there are bad ones, there are free ones, there are paid ones. And then at the same time, while we're doing that, starting to formulate their compensation strategy. Okay, so now we have the data, now we have the structure. Where do you want to position yourself in the market? Do you want to be market leading, market matching, or perhaps market lagging? And some people will lag in the market and pay lower amounts. But that, as we said earlier, that might be because they have a incredibly strong benefits package or a really good mission purpose, sort of those intrinsic motivators that I talked about, where people will join. And a lot of people join startups for that buzz that I talked about at the beginning. They'll join for the sense of purpose at the end of the day, not so much the paycheck.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I've learned today a lot about pay transparency and why it's so important. And actually, it's not as hard as it might seem. So thank you for sharing your experience. Thank you for coming on the podcast today. I will link your LinkedIn and your company in the show notes below. Anyone can, of course, reach out to you if they need any support on this. But really great to have you on today, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Super. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the HR and Wellbeing Insider podcast. Look out for the next episode, and in the meantime, sign up to our newsletter in the comments below to hear more from our guests and news and tips on HR and wellbeing. See you in the next episode.